Most people don't realize how fragile safety really is until someone decides to control it. I didn't think much about exits, access roads, or emergency routes when I bought my property. I had no reason to. I owned the land outright. It sat outside HOA boundaries, and the single gravel road leading in and out had existed longer than the neighborhood itself. What I didn't know was how dangerous entitlement becomes when people convince themselves that rules give them power over others. Because the day the HOA blocked my only exit wasn't about dues, compliance, or community standards. It was about control. And when they touched my exit, they crossed a line that even the law does not forgive. I bought the property for peace. 78 acres of wooded land at the edge of a lake, quiet enough that you could hear the wind moving through the trees before you ever saw it. The listing made one thing very clear: not part of any homeowners association. That mattered to me. I dealt with HOAs before and learned that once you give them authority, they never stop expanding it. This place had one narrow gravel road connecting it to the county highway. It wasn't fancy, but it was legal, surveyed, and recorded. I checked that twice before signing. For the first few months, everything was exactly what I'd hoped for. Mornings were quiet. Evenings were still. I worked remotely, kept to myself, and had no reason to interact with the nearby neighborhood tucked behind a decorative stone entrance and a large HOA sign. I knew they existed. I just didn't belong to them, and that seemed to bother them more than I expected. It started with looks. Cars are slowing down near the edge of my road. People are standing a little too long near the tree line. Then came the first letter placed in my mailbox without a stamp. It claimed I was using a community access route without authorization and demanded I attend an HOA meeting. I ignored it. I wasn't part of their association, and the road wasn't theirs. A week later, orange cones appeared along the gravel road, not blocking it, just narrowing it. The next morning, a temporary sign was added: private access, HOA only. That got my attention. I photographed everything and removed nothing. I wanted to see how far they were willing to go. 2 days later, I found the road completely blocked. A steel gate had been installed overnight, chained shut, with a keypad mounted to a post. There was no notice, no warning, no emergency access, just a locked gate between my property and the outside world. I stood there longer than I probably should have. Not angry, not panicked, just processing the reality of what that meant. If there were a fire, an injury, or even a medical emergency, I was trapped. Anyone on my land was trapped, and the people who did this knew exactly what they were doing. By that afternoon, an HOA representative showed up. She spoke calmly, confidently, and incorrectly. She said the road had always been intended for community use. She said safety concerns required controlled access. She said I could apply for a keypad code once I agreed to comply with HOA standards. I asked one question: what happens if there's a fire? She smiled and said that emergency services would be given access if necessary. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was arrogance, and arrogance collapses the moment it meets the wrong authority. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't touch the gate. I went back inside, opened my laptop, and made one call that would turn their control into a liability. They thought they had blocked a road. What they actually blocked was their own future. The next morning, the tension was thicker than the fog that rolled off the lake. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, staring at the steel gate from a distance. It didn't look different than the day before, yet its presence felt heavier. Every vehicle, every delivery, every footstep I'd take in or out of my property now carried risk. The HOA may have thought they were asserting authority, but they had only created a dangerous situation, and I was about to expose it. I called the county fire marshal. I didn't explain, I didn't negotiate. I simply told them the truth. My only exit had been blocked overnight. I described the road, the gate, and the lack of any emergency access. Within an hour, a fire marshal arrived. Not just any officer, but someone whose presence alone commands attention. They wore a crisp uniform, carried a small notebook, and didn't waste a second with small talk. We walked the road together, every footstep crunching on gravel, every branch overhead bending with the wind. I showed the blocked path, the keypad, the signs, and the cones that had appeared over the past week. They didn't flinch. They didn't shake their head or mutter. They simply nodded, took photos, and wrote notes. "Do you understand how serious this is?" the marshal asked quietly, almost rhetorically. I nodded. I had researched this before the call. I knew that blocking an emergency access route is a violation of county and state fire codes. I also knew that it doesn't matter if someone claims private property. It is illegal to impede emergency egress. The HOA hadn't just overstepped. They had broken the law. By midday, a marked fire department vehicle rolled down the narrow gravel road, lights flashing, sirens muted but attention-grabbing. Neighbors peeked out of their windows, some confused, some wide-eyed. The marshal didn't need to speak loudly. Authority doesn't need volume, it is felt. They inspected the gate, measured distances, took photos of signage, and walked the length of the road. Every step underscored the seriousness of the situation. If anything had happened here overnight, a fire, a medical emergency, a vehicle accident, it could have been catastrophic, and the HOA's decision had made it inevitable. Meanwhile, I received a call from an HOA board member. Their voice was sharp, defensive, and oddly high-pitched, a clear contrast to their calm letters. "We're just maintaining community standards," they said. "Safety concerns." I let them speak, but I didn't respond. The fire marshal was now involved. Words, polite or threatening, no longer mattered. There is a power in official authority that cannot be bargained with, ignored, or circumvented. By mid-afternoon, the marshal issued a formal notice. The steel gate had to be removed immediately. Emergency access had to be restored. Any obstruction of that road in the future would carry fines, penalties, and potential criminal liability. The HOA could argue all they wanted in their community meetings or newsletters, but the law was clear, and it favored safety over entitlement. I watched as the gate was cut free, chains falling with a metallic clatter that felt louder than any argument could ever be. Orange cones and signs were removed. The road was mine again, fully, legally, irreversibly. The fire marshal gave me a quick briefing on my responsibilities and left, their presence lingering like a calm but unmistakable warning. As I stood there, gravel under my boots, I realized this wasn't just about a gate. It was about understanding boundaries, the consequences of arrogance, and the limits of control. The HOA had assumed power, but the moment the right authority walked in, their illusion collapsed. That day, I didn't just regain access to my property. I regained the certainty that safety, law, and reason can always outmatch entitlement. And somewhere behind the trees, I could sense the HOA members whispering, calculating, wondering how it had all gone so wrong in such a short time. The morning after the gate was removed, the property felt different, not just because the road was open, but because the atmosphere had shifted. The quiet I had sought when buying this land returned, but it was sharper now, almost vigilant. I walked along the gravel path toward the county highway, listening to the crunch beneath my boots, every sound amplified by the realization of how close I had come to disaster. It was a lesson written in metal, chains, and overconfidence, and the HOA had just learned it the hard way. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered about the fire marshal's visit, the blocked road, and the formal notice. Some expressed disbelief, some relief, and some thinly veiled admiration for the resolve it took to involve law enforcement. For the first time, the HOA's carefully curated image of authority and control began to unravel. Behind the privacy fences and neatly trimmed hedges, I could feel their tension. The people who had thought they could dictate my access suddenly found themselves answering questions they hadn't expected, questions backed by law and consequence. Over the next few days, I noticed changes almost immediately. The cars that had once loitered at the edge of my driveway disappeared. The HOA newsletters, once filled with subtle threats and reminders of community standards, now contained cautious, overly polite language. I didn't need to respond or confront them. The law had already spoken, and they knew it. Every action I took was now observed under the lens of compliance, not entitlement. The balance of power had shifted, and I had done nothing more than insist on what was legally mine. During that week, I received multiple calls from contractors, delivery drivers, and even local utility workers, each asking if the gravel road was safe and accessible. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same path the HOA had tried to claim as their own, the same gate they had chained to block me, was now being cleared and reinforced as an official emergency route. In every conversation, I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing the HOA's arrogance had inadvertently led to improvements that benefited everyone, including themselves. But it wasn't just about access. It became clear that the HOA's actions had ripple effects beyond my property. Local officials began investigating similar claims in the neighborhood, and suddenly the organization that once operated under the guise of community service faced scrutiny they couldn't control. Lawsuits, fines, and compliance inspections became more than theoretical. They became real consequences for every action taken without proper authority. I spent one evening walking the perimeter of my land, the lake reflecting the golden sunset. It was hard not to feel a sense of vindication, not in a petty way, but in the satisfaction of fairness restored. I had bought this land for peace, and peace had returned stronger than before. The experience taught me that control is never granted by fear or intimidation. It is dictated by rules, law, and reason. The HOA had mistaken boldness for authority, and reality had a different plan. By the weekend, the neighborhood seemed quieter. The tension was still there, but muted. I could sense the HOA members watching from behind windows and fences, calculating, trying to figure out how their influence had evaporated in the span of a few days. Their pride had been checked, and every decision moving forward would carry the weight of what had just happened. I didn't need to engage with them. I had done my part, and the law had done the rest. Standing at the end of my gravel road, looking at the open path leading to freedom, I realized something profound. The fight was never really about the gate. It was about understanding limits, knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to let authority step in. And in that lesson, I found not just safety, but control over my life and my property in a way no HOA could ever take away again. The days following the fire marshal's intervention felt almost surreal. The gravel road was fully accessible again, the gate gone, the cones removed, yet the tension lingered like a shadow over the neighborhood. I could sense the HOA members recalibrating, trying to figure out how their carefully maintained authority had collapsed so quickly. But I didn't need to engage. The law had spoken, the path was clear, and the HOA's arrogance had been publicly exposed. That alone ensured they would think twice before crossing lines again. It wasn't long before I began receiving veiled attempts at intimidation. Anonymous letters slipped under my door, emails from HOA addresses using formal language that suggested legal consequences, and even a few late-night phone calls that ended when I picked up. Their tactics had shifted from open confrontation to subtle psychological pressure. I read each one carefully, photographed them, and filed them. Every note, every message, only reinforced the fact that they didn't understand the boundaries between influence and authority. Their ego had been bruised, and now they were trying to reclaim power in ways that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. One afternoon, I heard commotion near the property line. Curious, I walked out to see a small group of HOA members inspecting my road from a distance, whispering to one another, pointing at the gravel, the trees, the lake. Their energy was a mix of frustration and disbelief, as if the land itself had betrayed them. I didn't approach. I didn't need to. Their own awareness of the fire marshal's intervention had left them cautious, unsure, hesitant. Authority is not just about rules. It's about recognition, and the moment that recognition is withdrawn, control collapses. Even beyond the HOA, the county offices were abuzz. Other property owners had begun questioning the boundaries of their own community roads, emergency access, and compliance with regulations. The story spread quietly, legally, and efficiently. What started as a personal confrontation over a single blocked road had grown into a broader awareness of rights and responsibilities. The HOA's reputation as enforcers of order was slowly being replaced with a label of recklessness and overreach. Through it all, I maintained a deliberate calm. I didn't celebrate. I didn't taunt. I simply walked my property, inspected the road, and ensured that all legal requirements for emergency access were met. It was a simple, logical approach: document, verify, and comply. The HOA, in contrast, operated on emotion, ego, and fear of losing face. That contrast alone was enough to reveal the depth of their mistake. By the end of the week, I noticed a subtle shift in the neighborhood. Cars no longer slowed near my driveway. There were no more letters or messages. The whispers had died down. The same people who had once tried to assert control over my property now observed silently, carefully. Even the local contractors and delivery personnel treated the road with routine respect, fully aware that it was now both legally and practically accessible. That quite reinforced a truth I had learned over decades of property ownership: power that is assumed without legitimacy is temporary. It can collapse in hours when challenged correctly. The HOA had assumed they could control access, but they had ignored the fundamental principles of law and safety. The fire marshal had simply highlighted the consequences, turning their arrogance into liability. Standing at the edge of my property one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, I understood that this was more than a personal victory. It was a lesson for anyone who thinks authority can exist without accountability. The gravel road wasn't just open again. It was a symbol. A symbol that clarity, patience, and adherence to law always outlast ego, intimidation, and overreach. The days following the fire marshal's intervention passed with an almost surreal calm. The gravel road was fully open, unblocked, and finally under the clear oversight it had always deserved. I could drive in and out of my property without concern, and every delivery, every visitor, every emergency vehicle now had the unimpeded access that had been illegally denied. Yet the real victory wasn't just the road. It was the restoration of order and boundaries, a demonstration that law and safety always outweigh entitlement. The HOA had assumed control, but control is not something that can be claimed. It must be earned, respected, and legal. Over the next several weeks, I noticed the subtle ways their influence diminished. HOA newsletters that once carried veiled threats now read cautiously, almost apologetically. Board members were quieter, less assertive at meetings, manned or careful with their words. A few neighbors even approached me privately, curious, cautious, acknowledging that the situation had exposed the HOA's overreach and the potential dangers of unchecked authority. The story had rippled far beyond my property, creating awareness and accountability. The local authorities continued to follow up. Inspectors and fire officials conducted routine checks, ensuring that emergency access was maintained and that the HOA understood the seriousness of interfering with it again. Each visit reinforced a message the HOA had been slow to accept. Safety cannot be negotiated, law cannot be ignored, and consequences are unavoidable when boundaries are crossed. I stayed cooperative, polite, and calm, documenting each interaction meticulously. In doing so, I protected not just myself, but every future visitor to the property, ensuring that safety protocols could not be disregarded again. Interestingly, the HOA's attempts at intimidation faded entirely. Letters stopped arriving, phone calls went unanswered, and the lingering tension slowly dissolved. The very presence of law and authority had recalibrated the neighborhood's dynamics. What had begun as a personal confrontation over a blocked exit became a lesson in responsibility, boundaries, and respect for legal authority. The people who had tried to assert dominance over a road realized that their ego was no match for documented law, official inspections, and practical safety concerns. Walking the gravel road in the quiet evenings, I reflected on the experience. It was a stark reminder that ownership carries responsibility, that safety is never negotiable, and that authority, when misused, inevitably encounters correction. The HOA had assumed power, but in reality, they had only exposed their vulnerability. The fire marshal's presence had not just restored access, it had exposed arrogance and reestablished balance. The lesson for me was clear. Vigilance and knowledge of one's rights are just as important as legal protections, and sometimes the quiet assertion of authority is the most powerful tool of all. By the end of the month, the property had returned to the peace and solitude I had sought when I purchased it. The lake mirrored the calm sky, the trees whispered with the wind, and the gravel road stretched unobstructed from my front gate to the county highway. I had won something far more important than access: certainty, security, and the knowledge that reason and law always prevail over entitlement and ego. The HOA would no longer dictate what I could or could not do. They had learned, painfully and publicly, that some lines are not theirs to cross. As I closed the front gate behind a visitor one afternoon, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. The road was open, the land safe, and control restored. The HOA's failed attempt at domination had left them diminished, while I remained calm, protected, and confident. That gravel road was more than a path. It was proof that authority backed by law always triumphs over arrogance. I had not just reclaimed a road. I had secured a lesson that would endure far longer than any gate, any letter, or any fleeting assertion of control.